Armed forces have been forced onto the back foot for large parts of the war. They've had to dig in and defend their ground against intense and ruthless Russian aggression, withstanding daily drone swarms and fending off wave after wave of assaults. However, slowly but surely, the tide has started to turn, and now Ukraine has had enough of playing defense. It's ready to go on the offensive, and it has a massive missile arsenal just waiting to be unleashed. Fabian Hoffman, defense analyst, missile expert, and doctoral research fellow at the Oslo Nuclear Project, recently took an in-depth look at Ukraine's astonishing missile evolution over the last decade, charting the country's rapid growth and remarkable ambition in this all-important aspect of modern warfare. Writing on his Missile Matters blog, Hoffman explained that, like other former Soviet countries, Ukraine had a deep reliance on Russia for missile components and trade in the post-Soviet era. But that all changed in 2014, when Russia forcefully annexed the Crimean Peninsula and irreparably fractured its relationship with Ukraine in the process. From that moment on, Russia effectively became Ukraine's enemy, an aggressive occupying force taking over a sizable piece of its territory. Kyiv can no longer rely on Moscow as it had before, and it had to make some major changes in its missile industry. It still had some Soviet-era legacy design and production facilities operated by firms like Yuzhnoye and Yuzhmash, which has since been renamed to Pivdenmash, as well as the Luch Design Bureau, specializing in long-range missile systems. Ukraine also had several missile development programs in progress and worked hard to deploy the likes of the Vilka-guided 300mm rocket into service in 2018 and the R-360 Neptune anti-ship cruise missile in 2021. It had even opened talks with Indonesia about a possible export deal for the Neptune in 2021, while continuing work on a separate short-range ballistic missile program known under the codename RIM-2, which was repeatedly plagued with funding and timeline issues. In short, by the beginning of 2022, Ukraine had managed to make the most of its post-Soviet missile facilities, knowledge and resources, completing a couple of seemingly successful domestic programs and establishing a small but growing missile industry of its own. However, it didn't have the massive stockpile of missiles that Russia had, nor did it have the same extensive storage facilities, numerous production plants, or the colossal military budget of its neighbour. So, when the war kicked off in early 2022, Ukraine couldn't exactly counter the Russian missile threat. What's more, it appears that the Kremlin intentionally targeted missile industry sites across Ukraine to disrupt missile production and delay Kyiv's development of new weapons. It's used its own missiles to target the Pivdenmash production plant in the city of Dnipro in late 2022, for example. Reports also emerged in the early stages of the war of Russian attacks on infrastructure related to Kyiv's RIM-2 program, like the Pavlograd chemical plant, a solid fuel production site in the Dnipropetrovsk region. That plant was struck in May 2023 and then again in late 2023 and May 2024. These attacks, combined with the fact that Ukraine suddenly found itself having to defend its border regions and repel a gigantic invading force, meant that missile programs suffered serious setbacks. Ukraine was faced with a dilemma. It had to focus on its priorities, which mainly revolved around preventing Russia from gaining too much ground and digging in to stabilize key positions along the front lines. At the same time, it couldn't simply abandon its missile development projects. It needed weapons that it could use to strike back against the invaders. While exactly what decisions were made behind the scenes is unclear.
The night sky above Ukraine was not quiet anymore. What once echoed with the rumble of Russian artillery now roared with the thunder of Ukrainian missiles, streaking through the darkness like fiery spears. For months, Ukraine had been forced into a defensive stance, absorbing blow after blow. Russian drones buzzed overhead, missile strikes pounded cities, and armored columns pressed relentlessly against fortified towns. But all the while, beneath the surface, Ukraine was building something. A storm, a new phase of the war. Now, the storm had been unleashed. The shift from defense to offensive. Ukraine's military planners had grown tired of waiting, tired of intercepting barrages, tired of reacting. They knew that wars are not won by defense alone. Defense slows down the enemy, but it never breaks them. To survive, Ukraine needed to flip the battlefield, to transform itself from the shield into the sword. And so, Ukraine's high command began stockpiling missiles, both domestic designs and advanced Western systems. They studied weak points in Russian logistics, charted fuel depots, command posts, air bases, and ammunition hubs. They mapped out rail lines and bridges where Russia's war machine was most vulnerable. The goal was simple. When the moment came, Ukraine would not just repel Russia's advances, it would strike at the very arteries of Moscow's invasion force. First strikes. The first wave came without warning. In the dead of night, long-range Ukrainian missiles streaked toward Russian supply hubs in Luhansk and Donetsk. The impact shook the ground for miles, igniting warehouses filled with ammunition. Fireballs lit the horizon as explosions chained one after another, scattering debris like volcanic eruptions. Russian soldiers scrambled in confusion, commanders panicked, and communications went silent. By morning, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones revealed the damage. Dozens of supply trucks destroyed, stockpiles reduced to ashes, and key bridges rendered useless. But this was just the beginning. The missile arsenal Ukraine's arsenal was diverse and deadly. Western-supplied HIMARS had already proven devastating in precision strikes, but now QIV had expanded its toolkit. Storm Shadow cruise missiles, supplied by Britain, slashed deep into occupied territory, capable of flying low and weaving through defenses before slamming into high-value targets. There were also newly upgraded Soviet Terra-Tochka-U missiles, modernized with Ukrainian ingenuity to extend their range and accuracy. Added to this, homegrown systems like Neptune, originally designed to target warships, were adapted for land strikes. And behind the scenes, whispers circulated of experimental drone swarm strikes, where dozens of low-cost UAVs overwhelmed Russian air defenses before precision missiles delivered the final blow. Ukraine was no longer just defending, it was rewriting the rules of the battlefield.